The security guard barely glanced up as the old man shuffled through the metal detector. Gray hair, wrinkled khakis, and a faded polo shirt made him blend into the crowd, just another senior citizen at the Navy base open house, probably someone's grandfather tagging along for the free lunch and air conditioning. Behind him, a group of college students whispered and rolled their eyes, growing impatient with his slow pace. One muttered about old people holding up the line. Another scoffed, saying he should be at home watching TV instead of wandering a military event. But what none of them could see, hidden beneath that ordinary polo shirt, was a tattoo, a mark that told a story of sacrifice and valor few could imagine. It was a symbol that would change everything in the next 30 minutes. When the most elite warriors in the world caught sight of it, dismissive glances turned to reverent stares. Whispers faded into awed silence as they realized they were standing in the presence of a living legend. Welcome to Echoes of Honor. Before we continue with this incredible story of respect and recognition, tell us in the comments from which city in the world are you watching this video today. And if you believe stories like this deserve to be shared, please hit that subscribe button to support our channel. We're growing every day, and I sincerely thank you for being part of this journey. Naval Base Coronado buzzed with the controlled energy of a community open house in full swing. Families streamed through the gates, children clutched small American flags, and visitors wandered between displays showcasing everything from helicopter mock-ups to K-9 demonstrations. The annual event drew thousands of civilians eager to glimpse life inside one of the Navy's most prestigious installations, home to the legendary SEAL teams that had captured the world's imagination. The morning sun beat down on the asphalt as volunteers directed traffic and handed out programs. Food trucks lined the main thoroughfare, their operators already sweating despite the early hour. Near the entrance, a small crowd had gathered around a display of military vehicles, with active duty personnel explaining the capabilities of each piece of equipment to curious onlookers. Frank Morrison had arrived alone, as he did most things these days. At 78, he moved with the careful deliberation of a man whose body bore the accumulated weight of decades spent pushing it beyond normal limits. His cane wasn't entirely necessary, but it helped on days when old injuries reminded him of their presence. To anyone watching, he looked like countless other elderly visitors, a grandfather perhaps, or a veteran from some forgotten conflict, drawn to military events by nostalgia and habit. The truth was both simpler and infinitely more complex than anyone could have guessed by looking at him. Frank Morrison was indeed a veteran, but not from some forgotten conflict. He was Navy SEAL Team 6, retired after 32 years of active duty that had taken him to places that didn't appear on any public maps and involved operations that would remain classified long after he was gone. He had been there at the beginning, when the teams were still finding their identity, and he had helped write the book that every current SEAL still studied. But retirement had been kind to him in the way it's kind to men who have learned to blend into civilian life without calling attention to themselves. He lived quietly in a modest apartment overlooking the bay, kept his stories to himself, and attended events like this not for recognition but simply because he enjoyed watching the next generation at work. He had no family to accompany him, no grandchildren to impress with tales of adventure. His life had been the team's, and when that ended, he had learned to be comfortable with solitude. As he made his way through the crowds, Frank noticed the looks he received from younger visitors. Not hostile exactly, but dismissive in the way that youth often dismisses age. College students moved around him impatiently. Parents steered their children past him toward more exciting displays. Security personnel glanced at him briefly, categorizing him as harmless and forgetting him immediately. He understood their perspective. To them, he was just another old man taking up space at an event designed to showcase modern military capabilities. They saw the cane, the careful movements, the outdated clothing, and assumed he was probably confused about where he was or why he was there. Some likely wondered if he was lost or needed assistance finding his way back to a nursing home. Frank had encountered this kind of casual dismissal frequently in recent years. Age had a way of making people invisible, especially in a culture that celebrated youth and strength. He didn't resent it, exactly. He had been young once, had probably looked at elderly people the same way. But it did make him smile occasionally to think about how dramatically perceptions could change if people only knew what lay beneath the surface. Near the SEAL demonstration area, a group of active-duty SEALs in their 20s and 30s moved through equipment checks with the fluid efficiency that marked their profession. They were preparing for a demonstration of close-quarters combat techniques, their movements crisp and purposeful as they arranged mats and checked safety gear. Visitors gathered around the perimeter, phones ready to capture whatever spectacle was about to unfold. Frank found a spot in the shade where he could watch without blocking anyone's view. He enjoyed seeing how the teams had evolved since his time, noting changes in equipment and techniques while appreciating the constants that remained unchanged. The intensity was the same. The precision was the same. The quiet confidence that came from knowing you could handle whatever came your way, that was definitely the same. A family with 2 young boys pushed past him to get a better view, the father muttering something about people who couldn't move out of the way. Frank stepped aside accommodatingly, his movement drawing the attention of one of the active duty SEALs who had been watching the crowd for potential safety issues. Petty Officer Marcus Rivera was 26 years old and had been with the teams for 4 years. He had the kind of situational awareness that was drilled into every SEAL from day one, constantly scanning for anything that seemed out of place or potentially problematic. His gaze settled on Frank briefly, cataloging him as an elderly civilian who might need assistance if the crowd became too aggressive. But something made him look again. Maybe it was the way Frank stood, despite his age, or the way his eyes tracked the movements of the SEALs with the kind of understanding that came from experience rather than curiosity. Rivera couldn't quite put his finger on it, but there was something about the old man that didn't quite fit the typical visitor profile. The demonstration began with a brief explanation of SEAL training philosophy, delivered by Senior Chief Petty Officer James Valdez, a 15-year veteran who had seen action in multiple theaters. As he spoke about the mental and physical demands of SEAL training, Frank found himself nodding slightly, remembering his own experiences with early versions of the same challenges. The temperature was climbing as the morning progressed, and Frank decided to remove his light jacket. The movement was casual, unremarkable, the kind of thing people do dozens of times during outdoor events. He folded the jacket carefully and draped it over his arm, leaving him in just the polo shirt that revealed his forearms for the first time since arriving. On his right forearm, faded but still clearly visible, was a tattoo that would have been unremarkable to most civilian observers. It was the Navy SEAL trident, professionally done but showing the wear of decades. Beneath it, in simple block numbers, were dates spanning from 1965 to 1997. 32 years of active duty, compressed into a few lines of ink on aging skin. Marcus Rivera saw it first. His eyes had been scanning the crowd when they locked onto Frank's forearm. Rivera's entire body went still as his brain processed what he was seeing. Not just a SEAL trident, but one with dates that placed its owner among the absolute pioneers of naval special warfare. This wasn't a tattoo from someone who had done a few years and gotten out. This was the mark of someone who had been there from almost the very beginning. Rivera caught the attention of the SEAL next to him, Petty Officer First Class David Chin, with a subtle gesture. Chin followed Rivera's gaze and his own eyes widened when he saw the tattoo. Within seconds, both men were discreetly alerting their teammates to what they had discovered standing quietly in the crowd. Senior Chief Valdez was in the middle of explaining combat swimming techniques when Rivera approached him and whispered something that made the senior NCO stop mid-sentence and look toward Frank. Valdez's expression shifted from curiosity to something approaching as he recognized what his subordinate had spotted. The demonstration came to a natural pause as Valdez announced a brief equipment check. But instead of attending to gear, he and 5 other active duty SEALs began moving toward Frank with the kind of purposeful coordination that civilians might not notice, but that Frank recognized immediately. Frank saw them coming and understood what had happened. His tattoo was visible, and these young warriors had done exactly what he would have done at their age, recognized a brother and moved to pay respects. He straightened slightly, not quite coming to attention, but adopting the bearing that 32 years of service had made second nature. Senior Chief Valdez reached him first, the other 5 SEALs forming a loose semicircle around Frank. The movement had been subtle enough that most civilians didn't notice anything unusual, but Frank found himself suddenly surrounded by some of the most elite warriors in the world. Valdez spoke first, his voice carrying the respect that one professional shows another. "Excuse me, Senior Chief. Could we have a word?" The title hit Frank like a physical sensation. It had been years since anyone had addressed him by rank, years since anyone had recognized what he had been. He nodded slowly, his own military bearing becoming more pronounced as muscle memory took over. "I'm James Valdez, Senior Chief, Team 7. These are my teammates." Valdez gestured to the 5 men with him. "We couldn't help but notice your ink." Frank glanced down at his forearm, then back at the young SEALs surrounding him. "Frank Morrison," he said quietly. "Team 6, retired." The effect of those simple words was immediate and profound. Every one of the active duty SEALs came to a more formal posture, their entire demeanor shifting from casual respect to something approaching reverence. Team 6 wasn't just any SEAL unit. It was the most elite of the elite, the unit that handled the missions no one else could handle. Rivera, who had spotted the tattoo first, stepped forward slightly. "Senior Chief Morrison," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "we study your missions and training. You're a legend." The words carried across the immediate area, causing several nearby civilians to turn and look. What they saw was confusing at first: 6 young, obviously elite military personnel treating an elderly man with the kind of respect usually reserved for high-ranking officers or visiting dignitaries. Frank felt a flush of something he hadn't experienced in years. Not pride, exactly, but recognition. These young men knew who he was, knew what he had done, and understood what it meant. After years of being invisible, of being just another old man taking up space, he was suddenly seen. "That's very kind of you to say," Frank replied, his voice steady despite the emotion he felt. "But I was just doing my job, same as you're doing yours." Shin shook his head respectfully. "Sir, with all due respect, what you did was a lot more than just a job. The operations in Panama, the hostage rescue techniques you developed, the training protocols you established, we still use modified versions of your work today." A small crowd was beginning to gather around them, drawn by the obvious intensity of the interaction between the young SEALs and the elderly man. Parents lifted children onto their shoulders for a better view. Other visitors pulled out phones, sensing they were witnessing something significant even if they didn't understand what. Frank noticed the attention and felt a familiar discomfort. He had spent his career working in shadows, avoiding exactly this kind of public recognition. But Valdez seemed to understand his concern. "Would you mind if we asked you a few questions, Senior Chief?" Away from the crowd. Frank nodded gratefully, and the 6 SEALs formed a protective escort around him, moving him toward a quieter area near the equipment displays. The movement was smooth and professional, but it had the effect of making Frank look like exactly what he was: someone important enough to merit protection by America's most elite warriors. Once they had some privacy, the questions came in a flood. The young SEALs wanted to know about missions they had studied in classified briefings, about techniques that had become standard operating procedure, about the early days when the teams were still figuring out what they could become. Frank answered what he could, his memory sharp despite his age, his explanations precise and detailed. But what struck him most was the quality of their attention. These weren't casual questions from people making conversation. These were professionals seeking wisdom from a master craftsman, students eager to learn from someone who had helped write the book they were still following. As word spread through the SEAL community at the base, more active duty personnel began arriving. Some came openly, introducing themselves and asking permission to meet the legendary Senior Chief Morrison. Others lingered at the edges, content to simply observe a living piece of their unit's history. Frank found himself at the center of something he had never experienced: recognition not from strangers who didn't understand what he had done, but from the people who understood it better than anyone. These young SEALs knew exactly what his 32 years of service had cost, exactly what his missions had accomplished, exactly why the techniques he had developed were still saving lives decades later. The dismissive glances from earlier in the day had been replaced by something entirely different. Civilians who had barely noticed him before now stared openly, trying to understand why this elderly man was suddenly surrounded by obvious elite troops treating him like visiting royalty. Children who had been impatient with his slow movement now watched in fascination as their heroes showed him the kind of respect usually reserved for Medal of Honor recipients. One young boy, maybe 8 years old, tugged on his father's shirt and pointed at Frank. "Dad, who is that old man? Why are all the Navy guys being so nice to him?" The father, who had been one of the people muttering about slow-moving seniors earlier in the day, looked at the scene with new eyes. "I think," he said slowly, "he's someone very important who we just didn't recognize." As the afternoon progressed, Frank found himself given a personal tour of facilities and equipment that were normally off-limits to civilian visitors. The young SEALs treated him not as a tourist, but as a returning member of the family, showing him how the teams had evolved while constantly asking for his thoughts and opinions on new developments. Senior Chief Valdez walked beside him as they moved between displays, occasionally stopping to introduce Frank to other personnel. Each introduction followed the same pattern: initial confusion about why an elderly civilian was receiving VIP treatment, followed by recognition of the name Frank Morrison, followed by immediate shifts in posture and demeanor as people realized they were meeting a legend. "You know, Senior Chief," Valdez said during a quiet moment, "we have pictures of you in our team room. Pictures from operations that are still classified, with your face blacked out for security. But everyone knows who that is in the photos." Frank smiled at that. "I always wondered if anyone remembered those days." Remember them? Rivera, who had been walking on Frank's other side, shook his head in amazement. Sir, we memorized them. Every technique you developed, every innovation you pioneered, it's all still part of our training. You didn't just serve with the teams, you helped create what the teams became. As the day wound down and visitors began leaving the base, Frank found himself reluctant to go. Not because of the attention, which still made him slightly uncomfortable, but because of the connection. For the first time in years, he was surrounded by people who understood not just what he had done, but what it had meant. These young SEALs weren't treating him like a relic from the past. They were treating him like a founding father whose work had made their own service possible. The 6 SEALs who had first approached him gathered around for a final conversation before he left. Valdez spoke for the group. Senior Chief, I hope you'll consider this base your home. You're welcome here any time, and I know the entire team would be honored to have you visit whenever you'd like. Frank felt something he hadn't experienced in years: belonging. Not the polite inclusion offered to elderly veterans at community events, but the genuine acceptance of warriors who recognized him as one of their own. As he prepared to leave, Rivera approached him one more time. Senior Chief, I have to ask, how does it feel, knowing that everything you did, all those years of service, it's still making a difference today? Frank considered the question carefully. For years, he had wondered if his service had mattered, if the sacrifices he had made had been worth it. The isolation of retirement, the invisibility of old age, had made him question whether anyone remembered or cared about what he had given. Young man, he said finally, until today, I wasn't sure anyone remembered. But seeing all of you, seeing how the teams have grown and evolved while still holding on to the principles we fought to establish, I know it was all worth it. He paused, looking around at the faces of the 6 young SEALs who had transformed his day. You're the answer to every question I ever had about whether what we did mattered. You're the proof that it did. The old man who had arrived that morning is just another anonymous senior citizen left as something entirely different. Not changed in any fundamental way, because Frank Morrison had always been exactly who he was. But recognized, seen, understood by the people whose opinions mattered most to him. The dismissive glances from strangers no longer mattered. The casual invisibility of old age no longer stung. Because 6 young warriors had seen past the gray hair and slow movements to recognize the legend beneath. And in that recognition, Frank Morrison had found something he didn't even realize he had been missing: the knowledge that his life's work lived on in the men who continued the mission he had helped begin. Sometimes recognition comes from unexpected places at unexpected times. Sometimes the people who dismiss you as just another old man are the same people who would stand at attention if they only knew who you really were. And sometimes, just sometimes, the right people see past the surface to recognize the warrior underneath. Frank Morrison had spent decades creating legends. On this day, he discovered that he had become one himself. This story was brought to you by Echoes of Honor. Before we leave you today, here's our question. Have you ever misjudged someone based on their appearance, only to discover they were extraordinary in ways you never imagined? Or have you known someone whose true greatness was hidden beneath an ordinary exterior? Tell us in the comments about a time when you learned not to judge by appearances. And if you think stories like this need to be heard, hit that subscribe button to support the channel. We'll see you in the next one.